So often we assume that God's blessings will show up in the places we're familiar with, the spaces we're comfortable in, the routines we've built and rehearsed. We think His movement has to look like what we already know. We expect Him to speak on Sunday morning in the sanctuary, to show up through the people we've grown close to, or to manifest in the areas we've already trained ourselves to depend on. But the truth is, God refuses to be confined by our limited expectations. He does not operate within the small boundaries of our imagination. He moves in ways that startle us, in places that catch us off guard, because He delights in reminding us that He is bigger than our systems, greater than our categories, and beyond our control. If you trace the pattern of Scripture, you'll notice a theme: God blesses people in places they never would have predicted. Think about Moses. He didn't encounter God in Pharaoh's palace, where all the resources of Egypt were neatly arranged. He met God in a wilderness, staring at a bush that burned but wasn't consumed. That wasn't a place Moses expected divine revelation. It was dry. It was ordinary. It was overlooked. Yet God decided, right here is where I will reveal myself. Or consider Jacob. He wasn't kneeling at an altar when heaven opened. He was in the middle of the desert, using a rock for a pillow. And in that uncomfortable, unlikely space, he saw angels ascending and descending, and he named the place Bethel, the house of God. Why does God do this? Because if blessings only showed up in the places we predict, we'd start to confuse our planning with His providence. We'd start thinking we could map out His moves. But God's blessings are not restricted to the familiar. They are rooted in His sovereignty. He blesses us in unexpected places to stretch our faith, to force us to recognize that He is not dependent on our systems of comfort. He is God all by Himself, and He wants us to know that His power is not tied to geography, circumstance, or convenience. Now here's where it gets practical. Psychologically, human beings crave predictability. We want to know where provision is coming from when it's arriving, and what it will look like. Our brains are wired for patterns. But if you always know where the blessing is coming from, faith doesn't get exercised. You just become a manager of routine, rather than a disciple who trusts in divine surprises. That's why God will often disrupt the familiar. He'll allow what you expected to dry up, so that He can show you a stream you didn't even know was there. Just ask Elijah, who thought the brook would always flow, until it didn't. And when it dried up, God redirected him to a widow in Zarephath, a place he never thought provision would come from. This principle also carries a deep philosophical weight. If God is infinite, then by definition, He cannot be reduced to what is foreseeable. His actions must transcend human logic, because the finite mind cannot fully contain infinite possibility. That means He must bless us in places that do not fit our prearranged categories. Otherwise, He would cease to be infinite and would simply become predictable. But God does not exist to reinforce our sense of control. He exists to expand our capacity to trust. So let me challenge you. Stop limiting your expectation of where God can move. Don't only look for Him in the church service. He may show up in your workplace, through a conversation you didn't plan to have. Don't only look for Him in the support of those closest to you. He may raise up a stranger to open the very door you've been praying about. Don't only look for him in the victories. He may meet you in the loss, in the weakness, in the low place where you least wanted to be. Because sometimes the place you're trying to get out of is the very place God has chosen to bless you in. And here is the beauty of it. When the blessing comes from an unexpected place, you know without question that it wasn't your own hand that made it happen. It wasn't your networking, your intelligence, or your careful planning. It was the sovereignty of God. And when you know that, your worship deepens, your trust strengthens, and your perspective shifts. You start walking with open eyes because you realize that at any moment, in any place, God could break through and change everything. So if you're in a season where nothing looks familiar, where everything feels uncomfortable, don't despair. That might be the very stage God has chosen to display his blessing. The blessing doesn't always wait for the predictable moment. Sometimes it shows up in the wilderness, in the prison, in the brokenness, in the place you thought was empty. And when it does, you'll understand why he does it this way. He blesses in unexpected places so that his people will learn not to rely on the place, but on his presence. When we hear the word wilderness, we think of emptiness, dryness, desolation. It's the kind of place nobody volunteers to go. We associate it with struggle, lack, and isolation. Yet in the story of God's people, the wilderness is rarely wasted space. In fact, it often becomes the workshop of the Almighty. It's the place where he shapes character, builds resilience, and reveals his provision in ways that could never be discovered on the smooth road of comfort. The wilderness is where God strips away distractions so that we can see him more clearly. Israel had to learn this firsthand. They came out of Egypt with chains broken, but with a mentality still bound. God didn't immediately lead them to the promised land. Instead, he led them into the wilderness, because before they could handle abundance, they had to be trained in obedience. Before they could enjoy prosperity, they had to learn dependency. That's why manna fell from the sky one day at a time. God was teaching them, don't get ahead of me. Don't try to stockpile control. Trust me daily. The wilderness was not punishment, it was preparation. And that's where many of us struggle. We mistake God's preparation for God's absence. When life feels dry, when the resources seem scarce, when the path seems uncertain, our instinct is to assume he's forgotten us. But sometimes the wilderness is not a sign that he's abandoned you. It's evidence that he's training you. You're in his workshop, and he is chiseling, sanding, and molding you into something stronger than you were before. Now let's think about it from a psychological lens. Human beings crave stimulation, comfort, and certainty. We want full schedules, predictable outcomes, and enough resources stacked up to silence our anxieties. But the wilderness disrupts all of that. It denies us the illusions we cling to. In the silence, in the scarcity, in the waiting, we're forced to confront the reality of our own limits. And that's uncomfortable. But it's also necessary, because transformation rarely happens in comfort zones. We don't grow when everything is smooth. We grow when everything is stretched. The wilderness is God's classroom for stretching the soul. Philosophically, this makes sense too. The human spirit cannot rise without resistance. Just as muscles only strengthen when pushed against weight, our faith only matures when pressed against difficulty. God doesn't send us into the wilderness to break us down. He sends us there to build us up. It's paradoxical, but it's true. The place of apparent lack becomes the place of deepest abundance, because in it we discover that His presence is enough. That's why David could say, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Notice he didn't say he'd avoid the valley. He said he'd walk through it. The wilderness and the valley are not detours, they are necessary paths. Think about Jesus himself. Before his public ministry ever began, the Spirit led him into the wilderness. There, he was tempted, tested, and strengthened. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't random. It was preparation. If even the Son of God had to be proven in the wilderness before stepping into His calling, why should we think we can bypass it? The wilderness is where resolve is forged, where dependence on God is anchored, and where identity is clarified. And if you're in that season now, where things feel uncertain, where the manna you expected is barely enough for today, I want to remind you that you're not abandoned. You're in the workshop. The very scarcity you're resenting might be the setup for the supply you've been praying for. God may be withholding certain things now to develop in you a capacity that abundance could never produce. Because if He gives too soon, you won't be able to sustain it. But if He shapes you in the wilderness, then when the blessing comes, you'll be ready to handle it without it handling you. So don't despise the wilderness. Don't curse the silence. Don't assume the emptiness means God has forgotten. Recognize that He is at work in unseen ways. Sometimes the blessing is not what He gives you in the wilderness, but what He does in you through the wilderness. And when the time is right, you'll see that what felt like deprivation was actually preparation. One of the hardest lessons in life is learning how to handle closed doors. We don't like rejection. We don't like detours. We don't like hearing no when we've prayed for a yes. Yet if you walk with God long enough, you discover that every closed door is not an obstacle. It is often an oracle. It is God speaking. It is God redirecting. What looks like denial is frequently divine protection. What feels like rejection is often redirection towards something you couldn't see at the time. Joseph's story proves this. He was favored by his father, hated by his brothers, and thrown into a pit. That door closed. Then he was sold into slavery. Another door closed. Then he was falsely accused in Potiphar's house and thrown into prison. Yet another door slammed shut. At every stage, it looked like life was shrinking his possibilities. But behind the scenes, God was using each closed door to guide him toward the palace. And when Joseph finally stood in Pharaoh's courts, interpreting dreams and saving nations from famine, he could look back and say, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." In other words, if the pit hadn't closed, the palace wouldn't have opened. That's what makes closed doors so difficult for us. Psychologically, we equate rejection with worthlessness. When something doesn't work out, a relationship, a job, an opportunity, we assume it means we are less valuable. Our culture has trained us to interpret a no as failure. But in God's economy, A closed door does not diminish your value. It simply clarifies your direction. He shuts doors not to hurt you, but to help you. Not to punish you, but to position you. And the sooner we learn to trust that truth, the sooner we can release bitterness and step into expectancy. Philosophically, this raises an important point about perspective. We see life in snapshots, but God sees it in panoramic vision. We judge moments by how they feel. He judges them by how they fit. What feels painful in isolation might be purposeful in connection. The closed door you cry about today may be the very reason you're able to rejoice tomorrow. That means trust requires humility. Humility to admit that we don't always know what's best. Humility to believe that God's wisdom is broader than our horizon. Closed doors remind us that our finite vision cannot compare to His infinite plan. Think about how Jesus operated. He didn't force His way into places where doors were shut. In fact, the Gospels tell us there were towns where He couldn't perform miracles because of unbelief. He moved on. He kept walking. He knew that when one town refused Him, another town would receive Him. That's a lesson for us too. Stop trying to kick down doors God has shut. If He has closed it, it's not rejection. It's direction. He is simply saying, I've got something better, but you've got to move with me to see it. Now, here's where it gets personal. Some of you are still staring at a closed door, crying over what didn't work out. You've parked your soul at the sight of disappointment, replaying the pain, asking why, refusing to move on. But the problem is, while you're mourning over the door that's shut, you're missing the one that's opening. God can't bless you in the new place if you're still chained to the old one. Faith means you let go of what didn't happen so you can step into what God is preparing to happen. And make no mistake, greater openings do come. But they often require us to be broken down first. The pit, the prison, the rejection, the betrayal. All of it can be part of the preparation for something greater. Closed doors force us to depend on God in ways we wouldn't if everything were wide open. They push us to discover resilience, creativity, and faith that comfort could never cultivate. And when the new door finally opens, you're not only ready to walk through it, you're equipped to thrive in it. So let me encourage you. Don't despise the closed doors in your life. Don't interpret them as final. They are simply directional signs, pointing you toward greater openings. Joseph's pit was not the end. Paul's prison cell was not the end. Jesus' tomb was not the end. Closed doors don't cancel God's plan, they confirm it.